The chamber was enormous. It stretched upward like the inside of a hollow mountain, with rows of curved seats rising in circles around a central platform. Lights of every color floated in the air above each section, marking the territories of 43 species who had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years. This was the Galactic Council, and it had existed long before humans ever looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there. Ambassador Ilara Voss stood on the central platform and looked up at all of them. She was a tall woman with dark skin and silver hair pulled back tight against her head. She wore a simple black suit with a small blue pin on her chest, the flag of Earth. Her hands were steady. Her voice was calm. She had practiced this speech 100 times on the long journey to Ithara Prime, the station world where the Council made its home. "We come to you as friends," she said. Her words were translated instantly into 43 languages by the devices embedded in every seat. Humanity has traveled far to reach this place. We have made mistakes on our journey. We have hurt ourselves and our world. But we learned from every fall, and we stand before you now, not as conquerors or beggars, but as neighbors who wish to help and be helped in return. The chamber was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from respect or careful listening. It was the quiet of a room full of people who had already made up their minds before she opened her mouth. Ilara waited for a response. None came. After a long and painful silence, the session chairman, a Valith elder with pale blue skin and 6 eyes that blinked in slow patterns, simply said, "The Council acknowledges the statement of the human representative. Next matter." That was it. No questions, no welcome, no discussion. Humanity had been granted what the Council called observation status. It sounded official and important, but Ilara had read the documents carefully enough to understand what it really meant. Humans were allowed to sit in the chamber, but not vote. They could speak, but could not propose laws. They could trade, but only under restrictions that no other species had to follow. And at any time, the Council could revoke even these small privileges without explanation. It was not membership. It was a leash. In the weeks that followed, Ilara tried everything she could think of. She proposed trade agreements that would benefit both human and alien economies. She offered to share medical research that had taken Earth scientists generations to develop. She suggested joint exploration missions to uncharted regions of space. Every single proposal was accepted politely, assigned to a committee, and then buried under layers of procedure where it would sit forever, gathering dust. She requested meetings with senior council members. Most refused. The ones who agreed spent the time explaining, in very careful and very polite language, that humanity was too young, too aggressive, and too unstable to be trusted with real responsibility. They pointed to Earth's history, the wars, the pollution, the centuries of cruelty humans had inflicted upon each other, and used it as proof that this species was not ready. One meeting stayed with Ilara long after it ended. She had managed to secure a private audience with Archon Salvar, the leader of the Drawn Collective, and one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. He was tall and thin, with skin like dark polished wood, and eyes that glowed faintly gold. He sat across from her, in a room with no windows, and spoke without any pretense of kindness. "Your kind are tolerated, Ambassador, not welcomed. I suggest you learn the difference quickly, because the gap between the two is where your people will live for a very long time." Ilara did not flinch. She met his glowing eyes and said, "We have lived in worse places, Archon, and we are still here." Solvar smiled at that. It was not a friendly smile. The true nature of the Council's attitude became clear 3 months later, when the human colony on Helios 4 was struck by a massive earthquake. The colony sat on a fault line that the original surveys had failed to detect, and when the ground split open, it took half the city with it. Over 2 million people were trapped, injured, or dying. The colony's governor sent an emergency request to the council for aid: medical ships, engineering teams, supplies. The request was received. It was forwarded to a subcommittee for assessment. The subcommittee determined that Helios 4 fell within a jurisdictional gray area, and that providing aid might set a problematic precedent. They promised to revisit the matter at the next scheduled session, which was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks. 2 million people. Elara stood in the council chamber and begged. She did not use that word, but everyone in the room knew what it was. She laid out the numbers, the dead, the dying, the children buried under rubble, and asked for help. The chamber listened. The chamber expressed sympathy. The chamber did nothing. But humanity did something. Within 72 hours, human ships from 6 different colonies converged on Helios 4. They were not military vessels or government ships. They were cargo freighters, private transports, and mining rigs. Ordinary ships flown by ordinary people who had heard the call and come running. They brought food, water, medicine, engineers, and doctors. They dug through rubble with their bare hands when the machines broke down. They worked for 9 days straight, without rest, pulling survivors from the wreckage one by one. When the dust settled, 1.2 million lives had been saved. Not by the Galactic Council and its endless committees, by humans who simply showed up because other humans needed them. The Council took no notice, or rather it noticed and chose to say nothing, because acknowledging what had happened would mean admitting what had not happened. That the oldest and most powerful governing body in the galaxy had watched a disaster unfold and done nothing, while the youngest species in the room had handled it alone. That night Elara sat in her small office in the human embassy and wrote a report to Earth's unified government. She was honest. She did not soften her words or offer false hope. She wrote about the silence in the chamber, the closed doors, the mountains of procedure designed to keep humanity small and quiet and grateful for the crumbs it was given. At the end of the report, she added a personal note. It was only 2 lines, but it carried the weight of everything she had experienced since arriving at Ethera Prime. They will not accept us, not yet, perhaps not ever, but we will stay, because that is what we do. She sent the report and turned off the light. Outside her window, the stars burned cold and indifferent. Somewhere among them, on a dozen scattered worlds, humans were building, healing, and surviving, just as they always had, just as they always would, whether the galaxy wanted them to or not. The weight of silence. 15 years passed, and the galaxy barely noticed. Empires that measured their histories in tens of thousands of years did not pay attention to a single decade and a half. Seasons changed on 1,000 worlds. Stars were born and died in distant nebulae, and the Galactic Council continued to meet in its great chamber on Ethera Prime, discussing the same old problems in the same old ways. But something had changed. It had changed so quietly and so gradually that by the time anyone thought to look, it was already too large to ignore. Humanity had grown. Not in the way the Council had feared, not with warships and weapons and the loud, angry expansion that the Vigil's reports had warned about. Instead, humanity grew the way a forest grows, slowly, steadily, roots spreading outward in every direction, finding cracks in the stone that no one else had thought to look for, and filling them with life. Human trade ships now traveled routes that stretched far beyond their original colonies. They did not follow the Council's approved trade corridors, because those corridors came with taxes and restrictions that made fair business nearly impossible for a species on observation status. Instead, human traders found their own paths. They visited worlds that the Council had forgotten about, small planets on the edges of mapped space, home to species too poor or too weak to matter in the grand politics of the galaxy. And on those forgotten worlds, humans did something that confused every intelligence analyst in the council. They helped. On Verath 6, a world of shallow oceans and crumbling coastlines, human engineers built seawalls that saved 3 cities from flooding. They asked for nothing in return except friendship and a place to dock their ships. On the frozen moon of Palix, human doctors treated a respiratory plague that had been killing the native population for 2 generations. The council had classified Palix as a low-priority health concern. Humans classified it as people who needed help. Word spread. Among the small and forgotten species of the galaxy, a new truth began to take shape, that the humans would come when you called, and sometimes even when you did not. They would bring medicine and tools and food, and they would sit with you and learn your language and laugh at your jokes. And when they left, they would leave behind something more valuable than anything they had brought. They would leave behind the feeling that someone in this vast and cold universe actually cared whether you lived or died. The council noticed, and it frightened them. Not because humanity was building an army. Not because humans were stockpiling weapons or plotting invasions. What frightened the council was far simpler and far more dangerous than any of that. Humanity was building trust. And trust, in a galaxy held together by fear and obligation, was the most dangerous weapon of all. The Valith hegemony moved first. New trade regulations appeared. Hundreds of pages of technical rules that applied, by strange coincidence, only to goods manufactured by human colonies. Safety standards that human products somehow always failed to meet. Inspection requirements that delayed human shipments by weeks or months. It was not an embargo. It was something much cleverer than that. It was a wall built 1 brick at a time, designed to choke human commerce without ever officially admitting that was the goal. The Dran Collective took a different approach. They went after humanity's friendships. Dran diplomats visited the small worlds where humans had built relationships and made it very clear that any species too friendly with humanity would find its council privileges under review. Some worlds gave in to the pressure. Others did not. The ones that did not found their trade routes suddenly rerouted, their aid requests mysteriously delayed, their representatives ignored in the council chamber. Then came Marin Station. Marin Station was a small human trading post on the edge of neutral space. It was home to about 200 people, traders, mechanics, a few families with children. It was not important by any strategic measure. It was just a place where people lived and worked and tried to build something good in the darkness between the stars. On a quiet night, 3 explosions tore through the station's lower decks. 14 people died, including 2 children. The station's systems were crippled, and it took rescue ships almost a day to reach the survivors. The investigation found evidence pointing directly to Dran intelligence agents. The explosive compounds matched Dran military specifications. Communication intercepts showed coded messages between Dran operatives in the region. The evidence was clear and damning. Ilara Voss, now in the final year of her service as ambassador, brought the evidence before the council. She laid it out, piece by piece, document by document, with the careful patience of someone who still believed that truth mattered in this room. She showed the forensic data. She played the intercepted communications. She read the names of the 14 dead, including the 2 children, ages 6 and 9. The council formed an investigative committee. 6 months later, the committee released its findings. The incident at Marin Station was classified as an internal human matter with insufficient evidence of external involvement. Case closed. Ilara did not shout. She did not cry. She stood in the chamber with the report in her hands and looked up at the rows of seats filled with beings who had lived for centuries, who governed worlds and commanded fleets, who called themselves the Guardians of Galactic Civilization. And she saw, with perfect clarity, that none of it mattered. The truth did not matter. Justice did not matter. 14 lives did not matter. Not to them. She gave her final address the following week. It was not a speech of anger or accusation. It was a list. She read in a calm and steady voice every aid request humanity had filed that had been denied, every trade proposal that had been buried, every grievance that had been dismissed, every life lost because the council had chosen to look the other way. The list took 47 minutes to read. When she finished, the chamber was silent. Not the silence of indifference this time, but something else, something that might have been shame, if any of them had been brave enough to call it that. No resolution was passed, no action was taken. Ilara Voss walked out of the chamber for the last time, and the doors closed behind her. Her replacement arrived 1 month later. His name was Kofi Asante, and he was everything Ilara was not. Where she had been patient, he was precise. Where she had been hopeful, he was practical. He was younger, sharper, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was worth and had stopped asking others to agree. He spent his first week on Ethera Prime, reading every report, every transcript, every classified document he could access. He met with no council members. He simply studied. On his 8th day, he received a classified briefing from Earth's Strategic Council. The numbers were extraordinary. Human colonies now numbered over 40. Human technology, driven by relentless innovation and the necessity of surviving without help, had advanced rapidly. Human trade networks, built on fairness rather than exploitation, had created economic bonds with hundreds of small worlds across the galaxy. The briefing contained projections, analysis, and strategic recommendations. But one line had been highlighted by the Strategic Council's chairman, underlined twice in red ink. We no longer need them. The question is whether they need us. Kofi Asante read that line 3 times. Then he closed the briefing, folded his hands, and sat alone in his office for a very long time, thinking about what came next. Outside, on the endless corridors of Ethera Prime, the galaxy continued to spin. Council members walked to meetings and dinners and debates, confident in the order they had built, certain that the universe would continue to arrange itself around their authority. They did not notice the quiet man in the human embassy, sitting in the dark, making plans. They would notice soon enough. The quiet withdrawal. There was no announcement. That was the thing everyone would talk about later, when they tried to understand what had happened and how they had missed it. There was no angry speech, no dramatic walkout, no ultimatum delivered in the council chamber with cameras rolling and translators working overtime. Humanity did not slam the door on its way out. It simply stopped opening it. It began with small things. The human embassy on Ethera Prime, which had once hosted receptions and cultural events and open invitations to any species curious enough to attend, went quiet. The events stopped. The invitations dried up. Staff members who finished their rotations were not replaced. Offices that had once been full of activity stood empty, their lights dimmed, their doors locked. Human trade ships, which had become a familiar sight along dozens of routes, began changing course. They did not stop trading. They simply stopped using council-controlled corridors. Cargo that had once flowed through Valith customs stations now traveled along new paths that skirted the edges of council space entirely. It happened so gradually that most customs officials did not notice the declining numbers for months. Aid missions continued, but they too shifted direction. Human medical ships that had once responded to emergencies anywhere in the galaxy now focused their efforts on the outer worlds, the forgotten places where the Council's authority was thin and its interest even thinner. Engineering teams were recalled from Council stations where they had been volunteering their skills. Research partnerships with council universities were allowed to lapse without renewal. Kofi Asante still attended council sessions. He sat in humanity's designated seat, the smallest in the chamber, positioned at the very back where the acoustics were worst, and he listened. He took notes. He voted on nothing, because humans were not allowed to vote. He proposed nothing, because every proposal humanity had ever made had been buried. He simply sat and watched and waited. Some council members found his presence unsettling. There was something in the way he watched the proceedings, calm, attentive, completely without expectation, that made them uncomfortable in ways they could not quite explain. It was the look of a man who was no longer trying to be accepted, because he had already decided to leave. The first real alarm came when the Valith Trade Ministry released its quarterly report and discovered that human goods passing through their corridors had dropped by 60% in 18 months. Emergency meetings were called. Analysts scrambled to explain the numbers. The conclusion they reached was the one that made them feel safest. It was a negotiating tactic. Humans were trying to pressure the council into granting them better trade terms. It was a bluff. It had to be a bluff. Archon Solvar of the Dran Collective was asked for his assessment at a closed-door meeting of senior council members. He dismissed the concern with a wave of his long, dark hand. "They will be back," he said, his golden eyes half closed with boredom. Where else would they go? The answer arrived 6 months later, and it arrived not as a rumor or a report, but as a fact so large that it could no longer be denied. Humanity had built something new. They called it the Accord of Open Hands. It was not a government, not an empire, not a federation. It was a cooperative, a voluntary network of species and worlds bound together by shared agreements on trade, mutual aid, and collective security. There was no hierarchy, no ruling council. Every member species had an equal voice, regardless of how old it was or how many ships it commanded. The founding charter was written in 12 languages, including 3 that no council translator had ever learned, because the species who spoke them had never been important enough for the council to bother with. At the center of the charter was a single principle, expressed in a human phrase that did not translate perfectly into any alien tongue, but whose meaning was understood by every species that read it. No one gets left behind. 61 species signed the charter in its first year. They were not powerful species. They were not wealthy or ancient or feared. They were the small ones, the forgotten ones, the worlds that had sent representatives to the council only to be ignored, the civilizations that had begged for help only to be told their problems were not a priority. They were the species that humanity had visited over the past 2 decades. The worlds where human doctors had treated plagues, where human engineers had built bridges, where human traders had offered fair prices instead of exploitation. They remembered, and when humanity offered them a seat at a table where everyone was equal, they came running. By the end of the 3rd year, the Accord's combined economic output was staggering. Trade flowed freely along routes that bypassed council space entirely. New infrastructure projects connected worlds that had been isolated for centuries. Medical knowledge was shared openly, without patents or restrictions, and diseases that had plagued entire populations for generations were being cured. The council scrambled. Emergency sessions were called with increasing frequency. The Valith proposed sanctions against any species that joined the Accord. The Dran demanded that humanity be formally expelled from its observer seat and declared a hostile entity. Debates raged for weeks, filled with accusations and blame, and the particular kind of fury that comes from powerful beings who have just realized they are no longer as powerful as they thought. But the punitive measures never passed. The Council's moderates, species like the Orani and the Thesic, who had quietly valued their relationships with humans, even when it was unfashionable to do so, blocked every hostile resolution. They did not do this out of love for humanity. They did it because they could see, with painful clarity, that punishing the Accord would only accelerate the Council's decline. The Orani ambassador, a gentle being with silver fur and wide, sorrowful eyes, visited Kofi Asante in the nearly empty human embassy one evening. She sat across from him and asked him, simply and without politics, to stay. Asante looked at her for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was kind, but carried the weight of something that had been decided long ago. "You were good to us," he said. "I will always remember that. But you never once stood for us when it mattered. Not when they denied us aid, not when they killed our people at Marin Station, not when they buried every hand we extended in friendship. You were kind to us in private, Ambassador. But in the chamber, when the votes were cast and the silence fell, you sat with them." The Orani ambassador lowered her eyes. She had no answer for that, because there was no answer to give. "We remember kindness," Asante continued. "We also remember silence. And it is the silence that broke us." 1 week later, a small species called the Cathari, a people of no military importance and little economic weight, who had been council members for 800 years without anyone noticing, formally withdrew from the Galactic Council and applied for membership in the Accord of Open Hands. Their parting statement was brief and was read aloud in the council chamber by their tiny, trembling ambassador, who had never spoken in that room before, despite centuries of attendance. "The humans saw us," she said, "when you did not." The chamber had no response. Asante's final act as humanity's ambassador to the council was not a speech. He filed a single document, a formal declaration that humanity no longer recognized the council's authority to observe, restrict, or evaluate human civilization. It was not a resignation from the council, because humanity had never truly been a member. It was simply a statement of fact. The leash the council had placed around humanity's neck 20 years ago was being removed, not because the council had agreed to remove it, but because humanity had outgrown it. The document was accepted and filed without comment. That evening, the lights in the human embassy on Ethera Prime went dark. There was no ceremony, no farewell party, no final message broadcast to the station. The staff had already gone. The furniture had already been packed. The hallways were empty, and the only sound was the hum of the station's systems continuing their endless work, unaware that anything had changed. In the morning, council workers passed the embassy on their way to their offices and noticed the dark windows. Some paused, some looked at each other. Most kept walking. It was just an empty building after all. It was just a space where some humans had once lived and worked and tried to make friends in a place that did not want them. Nothing important. Nothing worth stopping for. And yet, as the days passed, the dark windows of the human embassy seemed to grow heavier. They became a presence on the station, a quiet, accusing absence that no one could fill and no one could ignore. The humans were gone, and the space they left behind was not empty. It was full of all the things that should have been said and done and were not. It was full of silence, and for the first time, the silence was deafening. The reckoning of empty halls. 10 years. That was all it took. 10 years for the cracks to become canyons. 10 years for the greatest governing body the galaxy had ever known to begin falling apart. Not from war or invasion or some great catastrophe, but from something far more ordinary and far more devastating. Irrelevance. The Galactic Council still met in its great chamber on Ethera Prime. The lights still floated above each section. The translators still hummed. The rituals still followed the same ancient patterns they had followed for millennia. But the chamber was emptier now. 12 more species had left in the first 5 years after humanity's departure, and another 9 followed in the 5 years after that. Their seats sat dark and unused, scattered around the room like missing teeth in an old mouth. The species that left were not the powerful ones. They were the small ones, The quiet ones, the ones who had always been outvoted and overlooked and told that their concerns were not a priority. One by one, they slipped away to join the accord of open hands, where their voices carried the same weight as anyone else's. Most of them left without making speeches. They simply stopped coming, and after a while, their seats were reassigned to storage or converted into additional space for the delegations that remained. No one in the council admitted what was happening. The official position, repeated in press conferences and diplomatic communications, was that the departures were temporary, and that the dissident species would return once they realized the accord could not offer them the stability and protection of the council. This was the story the council told itself, and it clung to it the way a drowning man clings to a piece of wood, because the alternative was to look down and see how deep the water had become. The economy told a different story. Council trade reports, once filled with confident projections and growing numbers, now carried a tone of quiet alarm. 30% of galactic trade now flowed through accord networks, bypassing council systems entirely. Resource-rich worlds that had once been locked into long-term council treaties were renegotiating their agreements or refusing to renew them. The Valith hegemony, whose wealth had been built on controlling the galaxy's most profitable trade corridors, watched its revenue decline year after year, as merchants found cheaper, fairer routes through accord space. The Dran Collective suffered differently. The Dran had never been traders. Their power came from influence, a vast web of client species who depended on Dran protection, and in return, voted as the Dran told them to in the council chamber. It was a system that had worked beautifully for thousands of years. But now that web was unraveling. Client species that had once been too afraid or too dependent to leave discovered that the Accord offered them something the Dran never had, a partnership based on respect rather than fear. Each departure weakened the Dran's voting bloc, which weakened their influence, which made it harder to keep the remaining clients in line, which led to more departures. It was a spiral, and Archon Salvar could not find a way to stop it. Desperation led to dangerous ideas. In a closed session, attended only by senior military and diplomatic officials, the Dran proposed a show of force. The plan was straightforward. Assemble a fleet, move it to the border of Accord space, and make it very clear that the Council still had the power to enforce its will. It was not an invasion plan. It was meant to be a reminder, a demonstration that the old order still had teeth. The vote was held in secret. It failed, but only by 3 votes. 3 votes between the galaxy and a war that would have consumed it. The moderates who blocked it did so not out of principle, but out of fear, because the Accord's combined fleet, while not as advanced as the Council's, was large enough to make any military action extremely costly. The age of easy dominance was over, and everyone in the room knew it. After the vote, Salvar retreated to his private quarters and did something he had not done in decades. He left the diplomatic wing and wandered through the corridors of Athara Prime, past busy offices and crowded markets, and all the machinery of a civilization that still believed it was the center of the universe. He walked without destination, following his feet wherever they carried him, until he found himself standing in a corridor he did not recognize. It was the old human wing. The embassy had been closed for 10 years, but no one had repurposed the space. It sat unused, a dead zone in the heart of a living station. The doors were sealed. The lights were off. But as Salvar walked the corridor, he noticed something on the wall, a mural, faded but still visible, painted in colors that no drawn artist would have chosen. It showed a blue and green world surrounded by dark water, with white clouds drifting across its surface. Earth, the human homeworld. Below the mural, mounted on the wall, was a small metal plaque. The writing on it was in a human script that Salvar could not read. He stood before it for a long time, studying the strange shapes of the letters, and then he pulled out his communicator and ran a translation. The plaque read, "We came in peace, we leave in sorrow, we wish you well." Salvar stared at those words. He read them again and again. Something moved behind his golden eyes, something he would never have admitted to anyone, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. He returned to his office and sat in silence for 1 hour. Then he called his senior aide and asked a question that he had never asked before in his entire career. Were we wrong? The aide, a young Dran who had grown up in the shadow of Salvar's certainty, did not know how to answer. Elsewhere on the Thara Prime, the Thessic ambassadors stood before the council chamber and did what no Thessic had done in 400 years of membership. She spoke against the council itself. Her name was Ilari, and she was old even by Thessic standards. A being of translucent skin and luminous internal organs that pulsed with soft light when she was emotional. As she spoke, her entire body glowed. "We watched a good people come to us with open hands," she said, her voice carrying through the silent chamber. "They asked for nothing extraordinary. They asked to be treated as equals. They asked to help and be helped. And we who call ourselves wise, we who claim to guard civilization itself, we turned them away. We denied them aid when their people were dying. We ignored them when their people were murdered. We buried their kindness under procedure and their patience under contempt." She paused. The glow within her body brightened until it was almost painful to look at. "And now they are gone. And we sit here in this beautiful chamber, in these ancient seats, and we pretend that nothing has changed. But everything has changed. The galaxy has moved on, and we are the ones being left behind." She announced that the Thessic would be leaving the council. The chamber erupted, but Ilari was already walking toward the doors. She did not look back. In the weeks that followed, a young drawn historian published a paper that spread across the galactic datanet like fire. It was titled simply, "The Human Error," and it argued, with careful evidence and devastating clarity, that the Council's treatment of humanity was the greatest strategic and moral failure in recorded galactic history. The paper was denounced by the Council's leadership. It was also read by billions. Then the Vigil, the Council's own intelligence service, suffered its final humiliation. A whistleblower, a career analyst who had spent 30 years writing reports that no one wanted to read, leaked the Vigil's complete classified assessment of humanity. The document was hundreds of pages long, filled with data and analysis and projections. But it was the final line that burned itself into the memory of every being who read it. Threat assessment, none. Humanity's primary weapon is compassion. We had no defense against it. The Council, at last, voted to send a formal delegation to the Accord, requesting dialogue. The vote was unanimous, the first unanimous vote in Council history. But as the delegation was assembled, as ships were prepared and speeches were drafted, a quiet dread settled over Ithara Prime. It was the kind of dread that comes not from facing danger, but from facing truth. The truth that you have spent decades building walls against people who only wanted to build bridges. The truth that you drove away the best thing that ever walked into your chamber. The truth that you knew, even as you were doing it, that it was wrong. And the heaviest truth of all, the one that no speech or delegation or apology could change, that some things, once broken, cannot be fixed. Not because the pieces are lost, but because the people you broke them against have already built something better from the wreckage. And they built it without you. Too late to mend the damage. The delegation arrived expecting a fortress. They found a garden. New Harmonia hung in space like a jewel, a world that had been nothing but barren rock and thin atmosphere 30 years ago. Now it was green. Even from orbit, the council delegates could see the forests, the rivers, the vast stretches of cultivated land that covered what had once been lifeless stone. Humans had done this. They had taken a dead world and breathed life into it, because that was what humans did. They walked into empty places and filled them with something worth protecting. The shuttle descended through clouds that should not have existed, over a world that should not have been habitable, and the delegates pressed their faces to the windows like children. Below them, the capital city spread outward from a central lake in graceful spirals of architecture that blended a dozen styles into something entirely new. There were towers of Cathari design, built to catch the wind and sing with it. There were Urani crystal domes that scattered sunlight into rainbows across the streets below. There were open plazas paved in patterns that told stories in languages the delegates did not speak, and parks filled with trees from 100 different worlds growing side by side. A drawn delegate, a young officer who had never left council space before, stared out the window and whispered to no one in particular, "They built all of this in 30 years?" No one answered him, because the answer was obvious, and it hurt. The delegation was received at a building called the Hall of Hands. It was not grand by council standards. There were no towering columns, no floating lights, no elevated platforms designed to make visitors feel small. It was a simple structure of wood and stone and glass, built around a courtyard where water flowed over smooth rocks and small birds from Earth sang in imported trees. The birds did not know they were on an alien world. They just sang because the sun was warm and the water was clear, and that was enough. Kofi Asante met them at the entrance. He was older now, his hair fully gray, his face lined by years of work that would have broken a lesser man. He had served as humanity's ambassador to the council, and then as the Accord's first chief coordinator, a role he had held for a decade. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most influential humans who had ever lived. He greeted the council delegation with a handshake and a polite smile, and led them inside. The meeting room had no raised platforms, no hierarchy of seating. A round table sat in the center, with chairs of equal size arranged around it. Every seat was the same height, the same design, the same distance from the center. The symbolism was so clear that even the most oblivious delegate understood it immediately. Everyone sits equal here. The council's lead delegate was a Valith elder named Thyren. She was ancient by any species standards. Her blue skin faded to near white, her 6 eyes clouded with age, but still sharp with intelligence. She had been chosen for this mission because she was respected, because she was eloquent, and because she carried enough authority to make promises that the council would be bound to honor. She spoke for nearly an hour. She acknowledged in careful and precise language the council's failures. She listed them, not all of them, but enough. The denied aid to Helios 4, the cover-up at Marin Station, the trade restrictions, the surveillance, the decades of institutional contempt disguised as caution. She did not make excuses. She simply acknowledged what had been done, and said that it was wrong. Then she made the offer. Full membership for humanity in the Galactic Council. Immediate voting rights with no restrictions. A permanent seat on the Senior Advisory Board. Financial reparations for documented damages, calculated at a sum so large that several delegates shifted uncomfortably when she named it, and a formal apology, to be read into the galactic record and transmitted to every world in known space, admitting that the Council had treated humanity unjustly, and pledging that no species would ever be subjected to such treatment again. It was, without question, the most extraordinary offer the Council had ever made. Every concession humanity had ever asked for, and more, delivered on a silver plate by the oldest and proudest civilization in the galaxy. 20 years ago, this offer would have changed everything. Even 10 years ago, it might have been enough. But not today. Asante listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not take notes. He simply listened with the same calm attention he had once brought to council sessions, back when he had sat in the smallest seat in the chamber and watched a galaxy pretend he was not there. When Thyron finished, the room was quiet. Asante let the silence breathe for a moment. Then he thanked her. He thanked her for coming, for the courage it took to make such an offer, and for the honesty of her words. He meant every word of his thanks. That was clear to everyone in the room. Then he declined. He did not do it with anger or bitterness or triumph. He did it with something that was much harder for the delegates to bear. He did it with gentleness. The accord is not a negotiating position, he said. It is not something we built to force you to give us what we wanted. It is a home. It is a home for us, and for every species that came to us because they had nowhere else to go. The Kethari, the Palaxians, the Verith, the dozens of worlds you never learned the names of because they were never important enough for you to notice. This is their home too, and I will not trade it away. He paused and looked around the table at the council delegates. Some of them could not meet his eyes. You are offering us everything we asked for 30 years ago, he continued, and I want you to know that we are grateful. Not for the offer itself, but for what it means, that you finally understand what you did. That matters to us. It matters more than you know. He folded his hands on the table. But the damage was never in the policies, Delegate Thyron. It was not in the trade restrictions, or the denied aid, or even the lives lost at Marin Station. It was in every moment that good people, people like the Urani, people like the Thesic, watched what was happening and said nothing. It was in the knowledge that we were surrounded by civilizations who knew we were being treated unjustly, and chose their comfort over our dignity. The room was so quiet that the sound of the birds singing in the courtyard drifted through the walls. That is the damage that cannot be mended. Not because we are unwilling to forgive. We forgave you long ago, because holding on to anger was never who we wanted to be. But because we have already built something new. Something that does not require us to beg for a seat at someone else's table. And we will not abandon the people who stood with us when you would not. He looked at Thyron directly. You are welcome to join us. Not as leaders, not as elders, as partners. The same terms we offer everyone. No more, no less. Thyron sat very still for a long time. Then she broke protocol in a way that no Valith elder had ever done in a diplomatic setting. She asked a personal question. Is there truly nothing we can do? Asante's answer was soft. You can do what we always asked. Be kind. Start now. It is never too late for that, even if it is too late for us. The delegation returned to Ethera Prime in silence. The report they filed was classified, but its contents leaked within days. The galaxy read Asante's words and understood what they meant. The council as it had existed for thousands of years was over. Not because it had been conquered or destroyed, but because it had been outgrown. Within a year, the Galactic Council formally dissolved. The ceremony was brief and poorly attended. The last act was the reading of a document that had been buried in the Council's archives for over 50 years. Humanity's original application for membership, filed by Alara Voss on the day she first arrived at Ethera Prime. It was a simple document, earnest and hopeful and full of the kind of optimism that only a young species reaching for the stars could possess. The final line had never been read aloud in the council chamber before. A clerk read it now, in a shaking voice, to a nearly empty room. We seek not to be above any species, nor below, only beside. Some of the species that had made up the council joined the accord. Others withdrew into isolation, too proud to accept equal terms with civilizations they had once ruled over. The Valith, after a painful period of adjustment, eventually petitioned for Accord membership and were accepted. As partners, nothing more. The drawn took longer. Archon Solvar resisted for years, but he was old, and the world was changing faster than he could hold it back. He signed the Accord's charter on the last day of his life, and those who were present said that his hand was steady and his golden eyes were clear. On Ethara Prime, now quiet and largely abandoned, a drawn child wandered through the old corridors with her parent. They came upon the human wing, still sealed, still dark. But someone had left the door unlocked, and the child pushed it open and stepped inside. The mural was still there, faded, cracked, but still there, a blue and green world floating in darkness, wrapped in white clouds, impossibly beautiful. The child stared at it with wide eyes. "What is that?" she asked. Her parents knelt beside her and looked at the painting for a long time before answering. "It is a reminder," they said quietly, "of a people who tried to be our friends, and we were too foolish to let them." The child reached out and touched the wall, her small fingers tracing the curve of an ocean she would never see. Then she looked up at her parent and asked, "Can we be their friends now?" Her parent smiled. It was a sad smile, but it was also something else, something that felt, for the first time in a very long while, like the beginning of something rather than the end. "Yes," they said. "Yes, I think we can." Across the galaxy, the accord of open hands continued to grow. It was messy and complicated and full of disagreements, because anything built by hundreds of different species always would be. But at its heart, holding everything together like gravity holds together stars, was a principle that a small, stubborn, impossibly hopeful species had carried with them from a tiny blue world at the edge of an unremarkable star system. No one gets left behind. Not ever. Not again.